Hey everyone, I want to welcome you back to our channel. This is the Ramanfart School of Arts. My name is Daniel, I'm the owner of the school, and today we are going to be drawing this skull that I picked up from Proko.com. So my aim in making this video is to break down the process of actually drawing the skull in as few steps as possible. So I broke it down into four steps, or what I like to call acts, just for dramatic effect. I hope that you enjoy this video, and if you do, please give us a like and subscribe. So digging into structure, the rule is keep it simple. Okay, so let's begin. Basically, anytime that we're starting with the head or the skull, we're going to start with the cranial mass, which is this big round object. And what's nice about this process is that regardless of what direction you're drawing the head from, or what angle you're drawing the head at, the cranial mass is basically going to be a ball. So we're going to start there. We're going to divide both diagonally and horizontally. And notice on the diagonal, I'm going just a little bit longer. My next step is to slice off the sides. So I'm cutting those off real quick, and I'm going to take some measurements to make sure that everything feels right here. So making sure that each of these boxes that we're actually creating is nice and even, it's going to be essential. And eventually those boxes are going to become landmarks of the hairline, the brow, the nose, and the chin. So my next step here is, once I've gotten all of my measurements and everything looks clean, the next step for me is to draw the chin. So indicating the chin is going to be double that space. So we're going to double our space right here, and this is known as the rule of thirds, heads and faces, skulls, it doesn't matter. We're always going to break that down into roughly thirds. And then I'm going to draw in the jaw, and the jaw is going to be two lines coming down at an angle, and then a much sharper turn towards the chin. So it's made up of 5 lines. Now, before I forget, the materials that I'm using is a gray toned paper that I picked up from Strathmore. It's the 400 series. I love that paper. And I'm using a black outline pencil that I picked up from General Pencils. Fantastic pencil. It's great to use. So that pretty much completes the structural phase of the skull. Now we're going to move directly into the features. So what I'm going to do is start with the most obvious shape that I can find, which is the nose, or the nasal passages, which eventually the nose actually sits on. So starting with that, basically what I see is a triangle, and then it gets a little bit more nuanced. So I will indicate just a little bit of information, but I don't want to dig into details just yet. What I'm really looking for is getting angles and getting proportions right. So I'm going to curve a line going from one side to the other. This is pretty much your brow ridge that goes through the front of the face. And I drew that circle in there, and that gives me some really good lines in terms of the position of the brow bones. It also gives me a lot of great symmetry, which is what I'm looking for in the early stages of a drawing like this. From here, I'm going to draw the eye sockets, and as I'm drawing this, I'm again making sure that I have some evenness, which is why I'm drawing both of them at the same time. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that artists make in the beginning stages of learning to draw the face or the head or the skull. What they end up doing is that they draw one side, and that comes out great, but then they're unable to get the proportions right on the other side. So the answer to that problem is going to be to draw both sides at the same time. Okay, so that feels right to me. The next stage is for me to really dig into the areas surrounding both the eyes and the nose, or where the eyes and nose will go. So looking at the sockets, looking at the surrounding area, I want to start to identify my cheekbones, and then slowly move upwards towards the rest of the head. Because if the context isn't right, then it just won't look right. So this is an important lesson that I think a lot of artists talk about, which is nothing lives in isolation. Just because the eye looks right doesn't necessarily mean that the structure around it looks good. So you have to make sure that you're focusing on both the smaller features as well as the overall structure. So right now what I'm doing is refining that, given the fact that I've already drawn the eye sockets and the nasal passages. Moving down now, I'm getting into the mouth. So we're starting to identify where the teeth land. And what I'm seeing as I look is that there's a slight opening on the mouth. Now notice, even though I'm indicating some of these finer details, I'm not getting into detail yet, and that's really important. I need to make sure that all of my shapes are cooperating with each other, much like puzzle pieces, because if I don't have that right, then I can get myself into a lot of trouble later, where I end up coloring something in, filling it in, only to find out that it's in the wrong place. Okay, so let's speed this up real quick. I'm using a knead eraser to clean things up and just to polish up the drawing a bit. I'm taking away any lines that I don't need, and now we're ready to move into shading. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is wipe down my drawing, and the reason why I do that is so that it actually ends up becoming smudge proof, and I lighten my line. This way I can tell the difference between my new lines and my old lines. So I always recommend doing that once you feel like your drawing feels like it's in the right place and everything seems set. Then you can go ahead and start to wipe it down a bit. The next stage here is for me to identify where exactly I'm seeing darks and where exactly I'm seeing lights. So I'm just quickly indicating all of that. And this is a good time for me to start to move down into the teeth. So I'm going to indicate just a little bit more value here, getting the eye socket in. And then I'm going to drop down into the teeth here. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I'm going to lose all of that information as I shade stuff in. So I want to make sure that I'm indicating just a little bit more detail here, giving myself a little bit more clarity as I'm drawing. So from here, I'm going to dig into just a little bit more detail with the teeth, just getting in some of these basic shapes. And my next step is actually to start to shade in those areas. One of the things that I'm not showing you guys is that as I'm drawing this, I'm actually squinting. And the reason why is because anytime that I'm dealing with value, I want to make sure that I have a clear idea of where my darks are, where my mediums are, and where my lights are. And I'm not going to be able to see that unless I squint. The reason is because there's way too much information coming into our eyes. We see things in 4K, or I guess now 8K they have, but it's very high resolution. It's a ton of information, and it could be extremely distracting. So one of the key things to do is to squint your eyes, and you'll get a much clearer picture of just exactly where your darks are, where your mediums are, and where your lights are. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a separate video known as light logic. But the key here is to indicate a clear set of groups of lights, mediums, and darks. Notice that I'm making a clear line of where I see shadow and where I actually see light. So I'm going to speed this up just a little bit so we can get through some of the more mundane aspects of shading, because it does take a good amount of time to get all of your values in. But really what I'm doing is just darkening things as I see them. And once that feels right to me, it's time for me to go over them once again with a paper napkin. So the benefit of me using that paper napkin is now I've got just a little bit of residue there that I can start to erase out where I see my highlights, and it gives me yet another layer, another distinctive feel of where there's light and where there's dark. So the pencil that I'm using here is another General pencil. It's a white chalk pastel pencil, and I love it because it blends really nicely, and I'm able to erase it if I don't like it. So that's one of the advantages to using a chalk pastel as opposed to a colored pencil, which is much harder to erase and it leaves behind a ton of residue. So this guy's a lot easier to work with. Admittedly, it is kind of flaky, so there is that disadvantage, but otherwise I find this pencil to be much easier to use in terms of identifying my lights. So I finally have a broad range of values here, ranging from bright whites all the way down to darker tones. And now I'm ready to start to refine it. So at this point, using a napkin doesn't make sense. So what I have in my hand here is a brush, and you can literally use any brush. It really doesn't matter, as long as it's got hair on the end of it, it'll do its job. And I use that pretty lightly on the paper, just to get the colors blended, but I don't want them too blended where everything blurs out. So a brush does the job way better than your fingers or a piece of paper napkin. So as I do that, now I have to bring back those lights and I have to really refine it. So the idea here is I'm going to keep adding more and more, both lights and darks, to really get some richness into this. So now I'm moving down the scale and up the scale to get my whites to pop and my darks to get really strong. At this point, I'm also looking for details and things that identify direction of lighting. I am not going to use every single detail that I see in this picture. That would be crazy. What I'm really after is the most important details that I see. So I actually am still squinting, but I'm just not squinting quite as hard. So whatever details come through under a squint is a good thing for me to add. I can't stress this enough. This is a very important point, is that drawing is not copying. I cannot stress that enough. It's interpreting. A great way to ruin a drawing, ruin a painting, ruin any piece of artwork is to quite literally copy something. The drawing becomes stiff, the painting becomes dull, it becomes too technical, and it just lacks the overall feeling that you're trying to get from what you're actually looking at. So the key here is that you're interpreting, and the way that I'm interpreting is very literal, but I'm leaving stuff out that I don't like, and whatever I find really interesting is stuff that I'm going to add in. And the best way I know how to do that is to squint my eyes just a little more than halfway, and that'll give me just the right amount of information for me to add to my drawing. Okay, so at this point I'm looking to see what other details I can find and what other additional shadows or highlights I can add to really give this a much more polished and finished look. So I'm looking around and I'm seeing, yes, there is just a little bit more dark on one side. Yes, there is a little bit of dark right under the eye socket. And what I'm going to do is actually speed this whole thing up because it's starting to drag a little bit. So I want to move into the final phase of all of this. But notice how just those last few touch-ups really finish off the piece. This is the part that's a lot of fun, and everyone wants to do it towards the beginning of the drawing, but it's best to get this all done towards the end. Okay, so I'm looking at my drawing and I'm thinking, it needs something. And I think the best thing for me to add to this is this red color, and it's actually a red pastel. Again, made by General. It's a chalk pastel pencil, and I'm adding this in for the purpose of really getting the black and whiteness to really pop forward. So by adding this red, what I'm doing is I'm drawing your attention to the outline of the object, and now the object starts to pop forward. So this is a technique that's used over and over and over again, both in drawing and painting, and it's the idea of giving it some type of context, some type of background. So let's say you have a light object on a light piece of paper and it's just not working out. Try adding a little bit of dark around it, and all of a sudden it feels like there's high contrast and the object is actually now popping out towards you. So that's the idea here. Simply adding this red pushes it forward. And what I'm using now is a rolled up piece of paper, a blender, and I'm just softening it. And by softening it, it gives it a blurred feel. And the idea of that blurriness is that that's part of the background, so it's not really something for you to focus on. So in the last few minutes of this video, I'm going to continue using my blending stump to soften anything that I feel looks harsh. And then what I'm going to do is add just a little bit more lights in to really get my whites to pop, because that's what feels like is missing. So as I use my blender, stuff is starting to get a little too dark. So I find it necessary to add in some of those lights again and get that to pop. And that pretty much concludes our mini tutorial on drawing the skull. For those of you who are new to the channel, please subscribe and share with your friends. We are trying to grow, and I hope that this information was helpful to you. I look forward to your comments, and hopefully I'll see you in the studio one day. Keep drawing, keep painting. There's nothing more rewarding than art.